This is Art in the Raw. I'm your host, Ann Kelly. Tonight, I'm excited to introduce you to Philip Mantione. Philip is a sound artist, composer, computer musician, guitarist, and educator. If you'd like to know more about Philip or the mission of Art in the Raw, take a look at the description below. Thanks for watching. You're a great example of someone using digital technology, but also pulling from classical composition as well. I'm not a musician, I'm a listener. So, in terms of defining making music using a computer, is there a better way to say that?
Computer music used to mean something completely different a few decades ago. It meant people with white coats with a room-sized computer and punching in a keyboard and then coming back the next day to hear what it sounds like. That's the way it was in the late 50s, early 60s. Now, computer music, I mean, I would challenge anyone to find a piece of music that hadn't used a computer in its production. Pretty much everything you hear is using a computer.
That is a very good point.
In terms of the content of what you're hearing, that's, I guess, where people will think about computer music as like electronic based, not trying to emulate anything in the acoustic world so much as to create new sonorities. And so those go hand in hand, though. I mean, to me, it's the difference between computer music and acoustic music is really the gap is closing quickly. And I don't really see a distinction. Where the distinction occurs maybe in terms of genre would be experimental forms versus traditional pop forms or classical music forms or things that are more mainstream. I came to computer music or electronic music from the acoustic world. My master's degree is basically it's in composition for acoustic instruments for classically trained musicians, orchestras, ensembles. That's the way I went through my graduate program with those things in mind, writing notes down for people to play. And then when I discovered computer music, for lack of a better word, it was a very freeing thing for me because not that it takes the humanity out of the music, but it's just so much more accessible and immediate. When you write a piece for orchestra, you'll hear it in your head and you'll put it down on paper, but you never really, really hear it until it's played. And to have it played really well requires really, really good musicians. And the whole infrastructure of that acoustic world is a very expensive and limiting thing for most composers. Very few get the chance to write for great orchestras. So computer music gives you that opportunity to create without those limitations in mind. The sky's the limit in terms of sonorities and what you record and how you manipulate it or how you generate the sound. So it's a very different, exciting world, I think, to be a composer.
So you can immediately go in and get a sense of what's in your mind.
Basically, you're hearing the final product immediately, which is
That's
pretty
fascinating.
Of course, there's production involved before you get there, but it's not like getting an orchestra to play it. I was a copyist for many years, and that's a whole craft in itself. The copyist goes between the composer and the orchestrator and the players. It's the last step before it gets to the players. So you can think of a copyist as almost like a language editor, I suppose, because they make sure everything is readable and perfect and performable in the best possible way for a player. But that line going from the composer banging out something on a piano, sending it to an orchestrator, orchestrating for musicians, going to the copyist, and then to the players. I did that for many years on Broadway and in Hollywood, and it's a very exhaustive process and expensive. So usually that world is commercial because they're not going to put that kind of money behind something that's not going to return any kind of investment.
I talk to musicians that play with a group sometimes, but a lot of times it's a solo project. And so they're thinking, oh, I need female vocals, and it's not immediately available other than using some digital tools.
I would say in the last 10 years, the quality of sample libraries that can mimic real instruments, strings, winds, just like an orchestra, is incredible. The quality of the sounds are incredible. They spend a lot of money sampling with super good microphones, good quality productions, great musicians, and they put these sample libraries together that you can now, with a keyboard, MIDI keyboard, access those sounds. You won't be able to achieve the same nuances as you can with real musicians, because there's something about that you can't, I don't think, can ever really duplicate. But I think a lot of the things you're hearing on television, films, it's all samples. There's a composer and there's a computer. And sometimes big budget films will take the MIDI version of what the composer has written and use that to actually orchestrate it for real musicians. That's what they do in Hollywood for big budget films. They'll have a MIDI mock-up, they call it, so that the producers can hear the music before they spend the money on hiring all these players to sit in a session. They want to make sure that the music is going to be right. So they want it to be as realistic as possible. So that's a whole career path to do MIDI mock-ups. There are people that's all they do. That MIDI will go to an orchestrator. The orchestrator will score it all out, and then it'll go to a crew of copyists, and it reaches the stand of the musician. It's a fascinating thing. For most people, don't realize what goes on with music, for films especially. I did some work on the Sony lot. I worked on Batman and Robin and Austin Powers and these big budget films, right? And they would have a 110-piece orchestra. These are union players sitting there on the Sony soundstage. And when you have that many people all getting union scale, if there's a wrong note and someone has to raise their hand saying, is this a B or a B flat? Well, every tick of the clock costs a lot of money. So, I've seen proofreaders of, music copyists fired because they just screwed up, and it costs a lot of money, and it's just not worth it. So we would like triple proofread everything before it even got to the player.
You don't want to be the guy responsible for messing that up. So I found a word on your website, electroacoustic. I hadn't heard that before.
Electroacoustic is electronic music that is played back. Actually, there's a few different terms that are used. Electroacoustic can mean the combination of acoustic instruments and electronic instruments, and sometimes interactive type of situation where an acoustic instrument is triggering sounds or playing along with electronic music, that kind of thing. There's also something called acousmatic music, which is intended to be played back, like they used to call it tape music. Now it's more referred to as fixed media music, where it's just recorded and produced in advance, and people go into an auditorium and they play it back through incredible speakers. I think the definition is without the intervention of performers. So it's just speakers and sound and an audience.
You have other musicians that you collaborate with, and there was one such co-collaboration that I believe was something along those lines that involved car speakers.
Did a couple of pieces with car stereos. We called ourselves the Autotelics.
Love it.
And we did this piece. The culmination of it was the Long Beach Sound Walk, which is something they do in Long Beach, California every year. And it's just like people doing all kinds of strange sonic things throughout the city and just walk around and hear people playing. And so me and 7 other people were in this parking lot, and we arranged the cars with the trunks open in a semicircle. And then everyone wrote some electronic music based on a certain form that we had in mind. I think it was based on an hour's worth of material. And like you would, okay, you're going to write 3 minutes of music. You're going to have 2 minutes of silence, and then 4 minutes of music. And, so with a certain kind of texture, it was pretty specific in terms of the description, but everyone had a different score, a different part. And then we all brought it together and hit the button, and they played all together. And so people were free to walk around or walk in the circle or walk around the circle and that kind of thing. It was sort of a performance / installation.
What sort of reaction would you get from the general public?
I think a lot of people were engaged by it. It's the sound walk, so
Mm-hmm.
that audience is sort of prepared. I mean, if we did it in a, I don't know, in a mall or something, probably wouldn't have been the same.
I think that's interesting too with visual art as well. There's public art versus art that's in a gallery,
Right.
that different experience of some sort of creative expression that you don't necessarily
Yeah,
expect to walk into.
that's a good analogy. Yeah. My wife is a visual artist. We've cross-fertilized in a lot of different ways in terms of the two mediums and collaborated quite a bit. So,
What kind of work does she make?
well, she started as a painter, drawing and
Mm-hmm.
painting, and did that for a number of years. And then we moved to New York City. I guess it was in the late 90s, and she started doing more media type work, film and
Mm-hmm.
video, experimental video. And then we did a few installations together. Now I think she's going to get back into painting since we have a nice space here for her to paint. That's the thing. When we moved to New York, we didn't have that space. So she kind of was forced to kind of reconfigure.
Well, that's nice to be able to collaborate together.
We've done some good work.
So on your list of the various things you do, you have down a guitarist.
Mhm.
So when you're playing the guitar, is there a digital component to that as well, or is that just pure guitar?
It's a really interesting question because I started as a guitarist. I've been playing since I was 8 years old, and I studied with a jazz teacher. So I sort of got into jazz early in my life. And I went to school for guitar at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood. And I got really into guitar at that time in my life. I guess it was my late 20s. I was playing a lot. I was playing a lot of improvised fusion type, jazz fusion type stuff. When I went for my master's, though, I kind of opened up my ears a little bit. I started listening more to the history of experimental music and
Mm-hmm.
what had been done. And it was a lot more exciting to me at the time than just what I was doing on guitar. So I actually put the guitar away for probably 10 years in the case while I was learning about composition a little more. So when I came back to it, and I came back to it fairly strong. I mean, I started playing a lot again, but it was a different thing. I was bored by what I would had been playing. I didn't want to really do that anymore. And then there was this other electronic part, and I couldn't really figure out a way to fuse what I was doing electronically and computer wise with the guitar. They didn't seem to go together very well, for me at least. A lot of people do it very well. I've never been able to cross that bridge. I'm still trying. But when I play guitar now, it's really guitar. I mean, there's some effects I use, but I don't really over manipulate the guitar as much as some other people, and I don't really do any kind of extended techniques like a lot of people do because I still love the guitar just as a guitar and with the technique that I've learned over the years. So it's a tricky situation. To answer that question, I don't really know what I'm doing in terms of how to incorporate guitar with what I write on this side. And I'm still balancing that. I'm still trying to figure it out.
I think that's interesting, and it isn't necessarily necessary to divide them. I go down these rabbit holes, and prior to Edison coming up with techniques to be able to record music, the only way anyone could sell or share music was by sharing the actual music that you would take home and play.
Right. It would sheet music.
Sheet music, thank you. I was
Right.
missing that word.
Yeah.
So, since the beginning of music, if it wasn't for technology, not that we don't all love concerts and live music, but as you mentioned, it's not always possible to have a live orchestra with you. So it's really technology that's allowed us to be able to share music and make it as large of a part of our lives as it currently is.
Yeah. And of course, whole technology of streaming is incredible to me as someone who used to have to go to the store to buy a record. I still call them
Mm-hmm.
records. My students call them vinyls. I don't know what a vinyl is. I mean, it's a record. The idea that you can just, type in a name of a song and it shows up and plays, it's just unbelievable to me. Of course, as usual, artists are getting screwed by the platforms and by the gatekeepers. They get screwed. You get a billion plays and they give you a couple of bucks or something. I don't know. It's some ridiculous amount, I know.
Mhm.
So I think in that way, streaming has been bad for artists. But on the flip side, people are now able to disseminate their own work, worldwide without having to pay anyone or to give anyone anything if they don't want to.
That's an amazing innovation.
With my students, I always bring this question up because they're from the generation of not knowing anything about, CD. What's a CD? I mean, literally, they don't. Some of them have never touched a CD, and which is bizarre to me. But I asked them, so now you don't have to have a record company. You don't have to have all these gatekeepers in your way. You can write something and have it be all over the world tomorrow. Does that necessarily mean that there's more good music or more bad music or just more music and with the same proportion? And I get a lot of interesting answers. And I think most people believe it's just more music with the same proportion of good and bad.
And what do you think?
What do I think? It's a loaded question because who knows? Who listens to everything that's out there? It's impossible. I tend to think that there would be more good music only because there was only so many opportunities for good music, 20 years ago. And now you don't have to play the game to write good music, and you can get it out in the world. And so I'd like to believe there's more good music. I'm an optimist.
From the beginning of recording music, tech companies have been high up in it. Music that we didn't get to hear before because you had those gatekeepers. I couldn't just make a song and put it on Spotify. Not that it's that easy, but
it's actually pretty easy. Yeah, scarily easy. There's a company called DistroKid that a lot of people use, and it's for $59 a year. They will publish as much music as you can write, and it'll go on Spotify. It'll go on all these streaming services for $59 a year. All you have to do is give them the music, and they do the rest. So whether it'll be heard or whether people will search it out, that's another issue, because now it's almost like a needle in a haystack with new music.
Right. If you don't hit those algorithms right, you could be out there, but is anybody hearing it?
Right. And it's up to you then to self-promote. You can get thousands, millions of hits on Spotify and make almost nothing. I think the paradigm has changed for commercial musicians anyway, that they depend on the tour. They depend on ticket sales and the tour and merchandise more so than ever, opposed to selling records, Although vinyl now, they're making money from that, but
that's kind of that analog comeback type of thing. But no, I would agree. Streaming is an amazing thing. I was a teenager in the 90s, so I was one of those kids recording songs off the radio and trying to cut out the commercials. I think that's an interesting thing with music and all just different types of art, especially with AI now. There's almost a rejection of technology and this fear that technology with AI in particular is going to water down the human spirit. That sounds terrible to me as well. But I keep going back to technology has been progressing for so long and has influenced so many mediums and so many of the things that I think we would have a hard time not having around anymore are all reliant on that. So I want to believe it's just an extension of that.
Well, I think you're right to an extent, but it is very different in another way, in that we're talking about content creation now. That's different. I mean, that's just purely different. It's different than the technology of editing or mixing music. They've had some intelligent things going on in music for some time in terms of where the program will suggest certain ways that something should be mixed. I don't want to get too technical, but it will give you a plug-in chain of like different things that should be there based on what it analyzes the music to be. There are online mastering services where before you had to go to a mastering engineer to get the music to be polished to an extent where it's going to sound good no matter where it's played. That's the idea of mastering.
Mm.
Now you can just upload a file online and it'll spit back some result, which is going to be better than what you sent, but not necessarily as good as a mastering engineer's ears who's got, 20, 30 years of experience. Totally different thing to me. But it's the content creation it's a paradigm shift. That's never been, and it's never been to the extent that it is now. And I don't really know what's going to happen with it because the stuff that I'm hearing, although completely banal and unoriginal and really lifeless, is well done. If that makes any sense, it's well done. It's as if you hired a composer to write some background music for my YouTube video. But you hear crappy music all the time on YouTube. It's just it's like hold music. You hear, and that can be easily generated by AI with the click of a button. So if you're a video editor and you need some background music, you're going to do that as opposed to go to a music library and pay for the license to use a real composer's music, which in all honesty could be just as bad because they're spitting out a lot of music to try to make money. It's its own little world, production music. But I guess my point is that I just don't know what's going to happen with it. I don't know how good it's going to get. I don't know where it's going to go. The one fault I see in it right now off the bat is that as a composer, when you're composing, the process itself sort of takes you on a journey and you're never really sure where that's going to go. And when a mistake, quote, mistake happens, as a composer, you have the opportunity to say, well, that's a cool mistake and I'm going to keep it. An AI is going to say it's a mistake and erase it, or you know what I mean? It doesn't recognize the mistake, the error. And that's one of the foundations of creative work, I think, in all mediums.
Oh yeah, the idea of the happy accident, that's one of my favorite things. Absolutely. So yeah, no, I mean, it's too early on right now to actually know what's really going to happen.
The biggest mistake someone can make nowadays is to ignore it, is to say, it's not real, it's not going to happen, I'm not going to use it. No, it's going to happen. It's real and it's going to only get better. And you either find a way to use it in a creative way or you're kidding yourself. I don't know if you know David Stout. David
I don't think
Stout?
so.
No, he was in Santa Fe for some time. He was teaching at the college there. He's fully immersed in that world in the visual way, in visual arts. And he's teaching in Texas now. But there are some people that have embraced AI and really using it as a tool as opposed to having it use them. There's your co-host. I see him now.
Hey, buddy. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of where I'm trying to follow the whole AI thing as close as I possibly can. And I feel like there's a lot of interesting tools within it. But there's, of course, that big division between a creative tool versus the artistry itself. So
yeah,
I'm excited.
As a gallery person, let me just ask you, are you shying away from having shows that are AI generated, or have you even been approached, or is that not the type of work that you deal with?
I made an episode about AI and art, and we were presupposing that people were going to start captioning their work like they used to with Photoshop. People used to say, this was shot with a 35 millimeter Nikon. There is no Photoshop on this. Oh. And then now people are going to start saying, this was made with Photoshop, not AI. But I think the following week, an artist sent me some work that was really complicated photo montage work, and it did have that little disclaimer that this is not AI generated. And there's been some other interesting cases where people have submitted AI generated work claiming to be photography just for the purpose of proving the point that no one could notice the difference.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a little disruption there, but I've yet to actually be approached at this point with somebody wanting to show completely AI generated work.
Mm-hmm. I guess my question would be, all right, if I'm listening to a piece of music that's AI generated right now, there's no comparison, I don't think, between AI generated music and music by a really good composer. I don't think they're there yet, but they will get there. And my question is, does it matter? I mean, you still have to instigate the process, as you know, you still have to provide the prompts, whatever they may be. You still have to take it beyond the initial generation of the music, although maybe they'll go from beginning to end eventually. So does it matter? Does it matter? I mean, I don't know. I mean, shouldn't the result be the only thing that matters? You know, like people always say the work speaks for itself. Well, does it matter? I mean, I'm the one that instigated the work. I may not have actually made every minute detail of it, but I instigated the work. It was my idea. Does it matter?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point we're at right now. What I believe is that music and art is the truest expression of the human experience, which is a very mysterious and crazy experience. And while AI can be trained through data sets on what the human experience is like, it hasn't been a human. We're not to AGI yet. AI is not quite at the point that we know of, anyways, that it can become self-aware. It would have to.
We're getting close.
I feel like it would have to be self-aware to really make music that was comparable. But
Yeah.
I do like the possibility of collaborating with tools. I'm okay with that.
Well, you, I don't think you're going to have a choice but to be okay with it because,
No.
as I said, it's coming. It's coming one way or the other, and people can fight it all they want, but it's going to happen. I keep thinking of, you know, when I first started music copying. Music copying now is all done in the computer. It's all done with computer notation software. But before that, as early as the 90s, it was handwritten in ink by really skilled music copyists that could look at a score and they could write out a violin part from that score in ink and have it be completely readable. Calligraphy, really. And I was just astounded when I first started seeing these guys work because they were just so fast and so clean and so accurate. It was an amazing thing to watch. And then when I came into it, it was right at the transition where computer notation was starting to happen. And so the benefit of computer notation is, like, for instance, let's say you're doing a Broadway show and you have, you know, an orchestra of 25 people and singers and everything, but now you have someone that's replacing the main singer and they're in a different key. Well, before they would have had to recopy by hand the entire piece of music for 25 people. Now in a computer, you can transpose that literally in a matter of a half hour. So of course, producers love that idea that they're saving all that money. So what happened was all these great calligraphers, music copyists, some of them that had been doing it for 30 years, could not make that switch. They could not get to the computer part of it. And so they faded away. And, you know, the people that did make the switch were able to hang in there and keep their livelihood. But in a way, it's a similar idea. I mean, you can't, I mean, it depends on your age, I think, and a lot of, you know, some people are just not ready to make such drastic changes. But
yeah, it's a huge change.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in computer music so long, to me, it's just all natural part of the process. So I don't really see it as a big jump. It's really just about learning the tools and how to manipulate them and how to make them do what you want them to do, as opposed to the opposite. You know, it's easy to sit back and let the machine do its thing, but that's not creative. What makes a good piece of music, what makes a good piece of art, to me, it's less about the content and it's more about the form for me. The form is the underlying essence. of the work. And it's something I've always struggled with in terms of finding that it's really easy for me to make great sounds. And I think it's probably because I love sound so much that pretty much any sound I make, I like. But how do you put that together in a cohesive piece of work is another, that's the biggest challenge, I think.
Are you using any sort of AI technology these days?
The extent of my use of it so far has been as a way of generating suggestions
Mm-hmm.
for in the production process, not in the creation of content process, but more about production. So for instance, if you write a track and you want to EQ that track or compress it or use it, apply some sort of processing, there's software now that will listen to it, analyze it, and suggest possibilities that you can then either use or not use. But it speeds up your workflow because otherwise you would be, old school, how do I EQ this thing? Got to listen to it, got to look for resonances. And so a lot of people still work that way, but I think you can really speed up your workflow and get to the more interesting parts of creation and spend less time on the sort of mundane. Not that EQing is mundane, but it's more of a time consuming type of thing.
Automating the parts that are maybe less interesting. Maybe a comparison would be if I write 1,000-word essay and I let spell check deal with the spelling issues instead of.
In a way, yes.
I mean, that's an odd comparison, but
it's pretty accurate, actually. Yeah. Like I said, most of the AI generated content that I've heard is pretty bad. And I've had better success with just hitting a randomizing button. And I would rather take an idea that involves randomization and generate 20 different things, 20 times, and then use my ear and my intuition to find what works and what's interesting, rather than having AI do something. I don't know. From what my experience with AI in terms of content is you're always referring to something else, which is another thing that sort of bothers me at the time because it depends on what it knows. It depends on the data set that it's accessing. And that's like saying I'm only going to write things that I've already written.
right.
There's no forward looking. There's no looking for that error, that mistake, and capitalizing on it. There's none of that. It's always looking backwards. So in that sense, ironically, AI is sort of looking backwards instead of looking
Right.
forward.
What do you think about the idea that everything is derivative?
Oh, sure. Everything's derivative, everything's political, but everyone's deriving things from what? From their own, body of experience, and everyone is completely different. And hopefully you keep generating more experiences as you live. So I don't know, derivative, they use it in a negative way, right? Isn't it the same as influence? I've been influenced by lots of sounds and players and composers.
Well, yeah, that was something that had come up on a previous episode I'd recorded with a few musicians on AI and music, or maybe it was the AI and art episode, I don't remember, but somebody had come up with the comparison of maybe some AI software was trained on a certain data set, and then they'd compared that to somebody went to art school and they were trained on X number of artists, and therefore they were influenced by those artists, and the parallel of those two things. Interesting things to think about.
There was a jazz player, I can't remember who, we're talking about being derivative in the sense of copying another artist, I suppose. And I forgot what exactly how the phrase went, but it was something like, it's okay to go and visit your friend, but don't go to your friend's house and stick your head in the refrigerator and see what's to eat. I don't know. It's kind of an obscure kind of thing, but you understand what he means, right? You still have to be who you are.
And being a professor and working with a lot of students, you see a lot of young minds trying to figure it out. And I think there's nothing wrong with, as they say, standing on the shoulders of the giants. But when you really become good is when you cultivate your own style and thing. And maybe it's influenced by X number of other people. But
of course, the Stravinsky quote, good artists borrow, great
Right.
artists steal. I mean, in a way, it's very true. But students are, when you study composition, you study other composers. When you study art, you study other artists. And you actually, I don't know if they do it in art school, but as a composer, many of the assignments are to write like this other composer, which makes you dig down into like, how is he writing? How is this content being generated? So that you can mimic it. And once you mimic it, then you understand it. And then you can sort of move on. The key is that you have to move on.
Right. It's interesting times we're living in. We don't know what's going to be happening next week. And then also with copyright,
whole nother issue. Yeah.
none of those rules that were established even apply to any of this.
The laws are way behind the technology. And this whole thing with the writer's strike, I don't know what kind of clauses they've talked about with the AI, but that's interesting. I'd like to see, like, how do they deal with it? Because they're trying to protect their livelihoods,
Oh, absolutely. And they should be. Yeah, George R. R. Martin and a whole other group of writers are suing OpenAI, which has, from what I've heard from the PR perspective, at least opened a dialogue.
I don't know you have a case to sue them, because what is AI doing? It's looking at everything like, okay, write something in the style of whoever. So they look at everything they've written. It looks at everything they've ever written, and it comes up with a style, and it writes in that style. So is that any different from hiring a writer to write a short story like Hemingway? Is it any different? I don't know. It's just the computer doing it much faster. I don't think it's any different. As long as it's not direct plagiarism, right?
And that's where it's really confusing is, yeah, you can't copyright a genre or a style, and then the actual act of training the AI generators with data sets, it's a different use. So that's not copyrightable. So where we're currently at with the AI companies, they're not actually infringing on anything or doing anything that's legally wrong, but you can see how the writers would feel that way.
And composer, of course.
And composers and artists. And yeah, so I don't know what's going to happen.
There has to be a dialogue for sure. And I think the companies themselves realize the power of what's going on with what they've created. It's a Frankenstein, and they have to take responsibility for what they're creating. And they're actually suggesting legislation, which is, I've never even heard of that idea, of corporations saying, we need legislation. Let's talk about it, because they're also looking at each other and saying, well, there's going to be this dogfight unless we have some rules about what can be done.
That is a wild thing. The corporations asking to be regulated, but it's a huge thing. I think it is necessary. So yeah, we'll see in next month what's
next month, exactly.
what's happening in that realm. But let's go back to your music.
Okay.
You compose music on your own. You have groups of other musicians that you work with.
Yeah, the last group that I was involved with, we call ourselves Triangular Bent. There's 3 guys, me, Jeff Boynton, who's probably the best circuit bending artist I've ever come across. I don't know if are you familiar with circuit bending?
I'm not. Tell me about it.
Well, it has to do with taking apart consumer electronic toys, games, anything with electronics, and rewiring them and making them instruments that can generate all kinds of bizarre sounds, basically undermining the original purpose of whatever the thing is, toys and things like this. And then they wire them in, and when that gets amplified, it's an incredible sort of palette.
So it could be like a toaster reappropriated.
Not necessarily toasters, because toasters don't generate sound, but for instance, an answering machine, or a child's toy, like toy keyboard, or anything like that. Jeff Boynton is one of the best I've ever seen with this stuff. So he's one of the players. The other one is Don Preston. He was one of the founding members of the Mothers of Invention, Frank Zappa. And this was like late 60s, early 70s. He's over 90 now, but still an incredible force in LA. brilliant pianist, but also electronic musician from the early days. I believe he's the one that sculpted the sound in Apocalypse Now, the helicopter sound, that iconic scene where the helicopters are coming onto the beach. He made that sound on a Moog synthesizer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and among many other sounds, but yeah, he was a sound designer on that film. Anyway, he's just a great person, and I learned so much from him. I guess we were together about 2-3 years in LA, did some shows around town, all freely improvised, nothing written really.
For improvisation generally, I just think is an
Mhm.
exciting terrain to be in.
I didn't really get into it that much until I moved to Santa Fe. I was a jazz player, and that's a different kind of improvisation. That's structured, a lot more, structured type of idea, playing over changes and things. But free improvisation, where you're literally free to make whatever sound you want in the context of this ensemble, it was something that I had to really think about and practice and open your ears up a little more than you normally would, and also be a little more adventuresome.
That's hugely in the realm of the unknown. Lots of room for happy accidents there, right?
That's right. Yeah, and also plenty of room for some bad music, but you take the good with the bad. And that's the thing about free improv. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and that's okay. It's just enjoy the experience and keep your ears open.
So I am curious if you could travel back in time or into the future to see some music. Do you know where you would go?
I would love to go to the future if I had my choice. I would love to see what's going on a couple hundred years from now, just to see what's going on, because you look at the course of technology, it is accelerating. There's, I don't know if you're familiar with the Ray Kurzweil in the book The Transcendent Man.
Tell me
No,
about it.
he's a futurist, and he
Mm-hmm.
was also, I think he was the head technology director at Google for a while. I'm not sure if he's still doing that, but he's made all these predictions, and they've all come true. He's basically predicted a lot of these events that are based on this exponential curve of technology and the growth of technology, and that because it builds on itself, and because computers get double in speed periodically, it's going to get faster and faster and faster. And that's been the case, of course, if you just look at the last 20 years. I mean, literally 12 years ago, or maybe 13, no one had a smartphone. Now everyone has a smartphone. Everyone's walking around with a computer in their hand. It's astounding, really. I mean, that's only 12 years, 15 years at the most.
And if you took away everybody's smartphones,
Oh,
there would
yeah,
be riots.
would be riots. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I go out of my house now without my phone, I feel lost, and it was like that was common. I mean, of course, you don't
Right.
have a phone, you want to make a call, look for a payphone.
Exactly.
But anyway, he's predicted that, and he calls it the singularity. It's the point at which computers become self-conscious and are actually more intelligent than a human being. It's a singularity because it's never happened, and we just don't know what that
Well,
means.
and I think that's what everybody's actually fearing about AI.
Yeah, it's the Terminator syndrome,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
I don't think it's going to be the machines against the humans. I think it's going to be the humans becoming machines. I think ultimately, I really believe you're going to be able to go to a store, buy the equivalent of a little flash drive, plug it into your skull, and I want a PhD in psychology. Okay, there's $10. They're on
Mm,
sale. You just buy it and you pop it in there, and you have all the knowledge of psychology for the last 300 years. Why not? You can do it on a hard drive in a computer. Why can't they figure out a way to do it directly into the brain? And I think they will.
I would imagine at some point. It is interesting right now. Everybody goes to the Terminator because
Yeah,
like it
dystopia.
it hasn't happened. Oh, but I saw a movie about it.
If the machines get too smart, they're going to realize that if we don't get rid of these humans, we're not going to have our environment. So we better just destroy all humans, get
Right.
them off the planet.
So you're going to go to the future and you're going to see some music. And looking back, growing up, getting into the guitar, who were your favorite musicians at that time?
Oh, from when I was first started, well,
Yeah.
of course, Jimi Hendrix. I also loved a lot of jazz players, George Benson. Later on, Pat Metheny and John Scofield. Not really too many classical players, mostly jazz and rock players. Jimmy Page, Jeff
Hmm.
Beck, all the classic guys. I was always influenced by the rock guys, and still am.
Hmm.
Stevie Ray Vaughan, incredible. He's probably the best blues player I've ever experienced. There's more than I can even think of. Pretty much everyone has had some sort of influence on me. If I heard them at all, they were going to influence me. Some obscure people like Scott Henderson, you probably never heard of, or Joe DiOrio. These are some of my
Hmm.
teachers from the Musicians Institute that were really incredible masters of the instrument. And I don't know, these are people that, especially jazz players, never really hit the mainstream, especially as a guitarist. Singers, jazz singers, sax players, they tend to be more popular than, jazz guitar players, I think, unless you're a guitarist. And then you kind of know these guys. But
How about Kraftwerk? Are they in there somewhere at all?
Kraftwerk,
Yeah.
not until later. I was into different genres back when they were just coming out, and it wasn't until later that I really appreciated them a little more. In terms of electronic people early on, Emerson, Lake and Palmer were a big
Hmm.
influence. I saw them live. That was an incredible experience. Pink Floyd, the big rock type groups were my biggest influences in terms of that.
So if you could have any sort of superpower you wanted that you could use for music, do you know what that would be?
That I could use for music.
Yeah.
It sounds cliche, but people always talk about composers and musicians. I want to get the sound out of my head, to get it out of my head and into the world. And I guess that's the holy grail. Of course, again, going back to the mistake, sometimes the things in your head are cool, but the things that are not in your head are even cooler. So, things you didn't expect. That's
Hmm.
one of the things that drew me to free improv is that idea. You never know what to expect or what someone else is going to do. As a group, there's a dynamic that's, if you have a good group with people that can really listen, magic, it could be magical. So, superpower, yeah. I don't know, to be able to play anything, you know, as a virtuosic performance would be fun.
And so you also have a good number of articles that are great resources for people. I saw one you wrote on synthesizers under $100. So
Mm.
you provide a lot of free educational content for people. The article on synthesizers made me wonder if you collected synthesizers or.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I call it collecting.
Mhm.
I did for a time buy a lot of gear and I use it, and it can be very addictive. I never really got into vinyl. I mean,
Mhm.
in the resurgence of vinyl, that is, I never really got
Right.
into it because I was so happy when it went away. I mean, I'm from the digital age, so when CDs came out, it was like, wow, this
Yeah.
is so great. I'm selling all my records because they're super heavy. I wish
Mhm.
I wish I hadn't sold them now, to be honest, because I had some really good ones. But anyway, analog gear, though, analog synthesis is another issue. That's something that I don't think, I mean, digital stuff can come close, but there are certain things that are just so juicy in terms of the analog sound, especially Moog filters and Dofer gear. There's a lot of companies that are now making, and this has been going on for a while, but modular pieces that use there's a system called Eurorack, which is a standardization of the way these modules will communicate with each other in terms of voltage. So you can piece together your own synth from all these different companies, with each one with its own little unique sound. That's very addictive to me. So if you want to say I collect, okay, I'll give you that. I do collect. But I'm also a big software junkie. So I mean, that's more of a collection than it is what I do with hardware, because I have more software than I'll ever use. Literally. I
Well, what
just
sort of software do you collect? What's that look like?
Software synthesizers,
Okay. Okay.
audio production, EQs, compressors, noise, all kinds of things that deal with the production side of things, including creation, content creation. So
More
there's some,
options, right?
yeah, more options, too many options. Mm-hmm.
So, for those that want to find your articles, music, other offerings, where do they go?
Well, I have a Bandcamp page. You can just look up my name, Philip Mantione, on Bandcamp. I don't know, a dozen or so albums I've produced over the last 20 years. Pro Audio Files is where I've done most of my articles, so that it's theproaudiofiles.com. And if you search my name on there, I guess I've written like 150 or so articles, a lot of reviews, some interviews with people, and some technical articles. And so they can go there. And philipmantione.com, my main site, which has everything I've done pretty much. I try to keep it up to date as much as I can.
And for other creatives out there, you've done residencies, you've received grants. Any advice for people who are trying to enter those worlds?
I mean, it depends on the residency, depends on the grant, I suppose. They're all different. The best residency I've done was at the Jurassic residency in Northern California. That was just a gorgeous environment. Jurassic it's named after the guy that invented the birth control pill. So a substantial amount of wealth behind
Yeah,
that.
I would think
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. So it's just a beautiful piece of land. And they have writers, dancers, musicians, poets, all kind of mixed together for a month. It's a beautiful thing. And they cook you a nice meal at the end of every day. And it was really a wonderful experience, the Jurassic thing. There's a artistres.com or .org, I can't remember which, but that's a website that shows residencies all over the world. So if you want to do residency, there's lots available. Not all of them are free. Sometimes you have to pay. Sometimes they pay you. You just have to do the research. But they all require a certain amount of time that you can get away from your real life
Mm-hmm.
and delve into this residency. Sometimes a couple of weeks, sometimes a month, sometimes 6 months. It depends on what you have and what your life experience is in terms of how far you can get away. I was lucky to get away for a month from teaching to do one, but it's not always easy for people that have to work to do a residency. So you should do them while you can, because they're really good just for meeting other artists and the experience of being away from the world for a while. Grants, that's discipline specific. Each discipline has its own sort of things. You probably know the ones for photography, or Paula Krasner for painting, or there's all these different ones. What I hate about grants is that the big ones, Rockefeller, Guggenheim Fellowship, all these things, that these people that made their fortunes on the backs of people exploiting labor in the early part of the century and late part of the previous century now get to dictate what art is and what's good art and what is bad art. From the grave they get to do it, and that annoys the hell out of me. It's one thing I just don't like about the whole philanthropy end of things. I think philanthropy, and we're getting into another subject here, but I think there should be a wealth tax that goes directly for the arts, not that they get to pick and choose, but that it goes into a huge pool and it gets split up between all artists. They do it in Norway. In Norway, if you're a painter, you get money for being an artist, whether you sell paintings or not.
Right.
If you're a serious artist,
Yeah, creative people. They're very important. But I think if you just walked up to the average person on the street and asked them what the value of an artist or musician was, they might be pressed to define that on the spot. What would you say?
Oh, it's a person that expands your consciousness in some way, in some one of your senses or more than one of your senses. A person that provides the opportunity for you to change. I think that's what art is about. And art in early schools is super important. I mean, if it wasn't for my early band days, the school band, I don't know where if I would have become a musician. I don't know what would have happened. It was such a great outlet. And the teachers I had were always so different from, the math teacher. They were this person that they made their living from making sound. It was such an impressive thing for me. Same with art teachers.
It's only the art teachers whose names I actually remember, quite
Uh,
quite honestly.
yeah.
No, I love that definition. That is beautiful. And I really appreciate your speaking with me tonight.
Yeah. Pleasure to meet you, Anne.
I hope to talk to you again soon.
Likewise, I think what you're doing with your show here is really great.
I appreciate that. I started this in 2020. I was sitting at home and realizing how many amazing people I knew, and I wanted to share them with other people. And then I started reaching out to people I didn't know. And it's just been an amazing process of making new friends. And
Mhm.
I've learned a lot.